Screw you, dude. Screw to hell, dude. You're being a real jerk. It's like,
Radio Free Intimate episode 269. Classy. Last week, I might have said a thing or two about the
unholy trinity
of Japanese black metal consisting of Psy, Sabbath, and Abigail. That, however, does not mean those were the first Japanese black metal bands. They actually have a black metal history going back to the very roots of the first wave there. They even got their own counterpart version of Merciful Fate or Death SS, that being the band Sabra Bells, who happened to put out their first full-length album the same year that Merciful Fate put out their debut album. And it's rather similar to Merciful Fate in terms of its incredible sense of theatricality, its adherence to very satanic lyrical themes, and its reinterpretation of 70s rock elements in a new, much heavier context. Like Merciful Fate, it also has much more complex than average songwriting for metal of the time, with a whole lot of different moods and sections to each song, and also a penchant for very clever counterpoint sections. Like this riff right here, it's an interesting reversal of that initial riff that started the song off. Very cleverly written stuff. And like Merciful Fate, they are also in possession of some excellently done lead guitar. So, if going by like the 80s definition of black metal, that would include Merciful Fate, gotta say Sabra Bell's probably the original Japanese black metal band. Maybe not black metal as we know it today. Back in the 80s, this would have been black metal, especially 1983, dude. That shit was pretty fucking dark. Another band in that mold would be Zadkiel, the original band of the bassist and drummer from the later on to be very important technical thrash metal band Doom. These guys only really put out the one single in 1986. They only existed for about a year, but it's definitely a banger. If Sabra Bells was like Japan's version of the really neoclassical aspirations of a band like Merciful Fate, these guys are definitely more along the lines of being Japan's Venom. Ultra primitive, blackened speed metal of a certain stripe. Surprisingly enough, it actually reminds me a lot of the later material from Abigail and Barbatos. Very much in that filthy early punk influenced black metal mold. And there's a whole lot of Motorhead going on as well. Helped out considerably, like Komorota's completely filthy sounding fuzzed out bass tone.
I know what you're thinking.
Aniki, this is all first wave 80s style black metal stuff. Surely Sabbath had to be the first modern black metal band from Japan.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Sabbath had an authentic full-length black metal album out by 1991. That's a year before Bellzlleb or Immortal or even the first Dark Throne black metal album. I mean, they gotta be the first Japanese black metal band to put out a full-length, right?
No. There is another.
And it is that first Japanese black metal band to put out a full-length album we will be covering this week. Bellzlleb. Unlike Sabbath, Abigail, or Psy, these guys were actually unabashedly a visual K band, albeit one that blended the sort of Seikimatsu style flair for theatricality with a startling dose of authentic evil in regards to their image. However, much like Sabbath, these guys did get their start by putting out a single in 1986 that was way more heavy metal sounding than their later material would be, albeit heavy metal of a decidedly more deranged and darkened stripe than what Sabbath was doing at the time. Honestly, the best way I can describe this is if Dead Can Dance decided to cover the Hellhammer track Triumph of Death, complete with Dead Can Dance's signature gothic-style atmospherics, as well as their surprising incorporation of some very spooky female vocals. This is, in fact, one of those Japanese bands with the chick vocalist.
Oh, brother!
Although in this case, the emphasis is obviously less on sounding pretty and cute and more on being frightening. The music underneath it rises up to match that sort of ghastly vocal performance quite effectively, with its positively deranged sort of darkened doom metal. It almost feels like you're listening to some kind of weird lost media. You stumbled onto something you shouldn't have heard, but here it is. And you probably got some kind of fucked up curse on you now. You know, these things are bound to happen if you go delving a little bit too deeply into the metal underground, especially if it's Japanese. It's certainly a unique little piece of heavy metal history, and it definitely does its job well with being this weird, scary sounding album that nobody's heard from 1986. It's actually probably the most well-known Bellzlleb album because of all that. But when the time finally came for them to put out a full-length album 3 years later in 1989, their original vocalist had left. Nobody actually really knows what happened to her, which is pretty
Boo! Haunted house!
and entirely keeping with the atmosphere of that period of their music. But when the time came for this full-length album to come out, they decided to hop on the train with both feet regarding this wacky new thing everybody was talking about called black metal, albeit in a very
Crazy ass, like the big ass cigar.
sort of way. For starters, there's a massive amount of doom metal on this album, specifically stuff that sounds a whole lot like a much darker version of Candlemass. But don't worry, it's still black metal. As you are no doubt probably aware of now, the new vocalist Ray does an excellent job of picking up where the female vocalist in the last album left off in terms of theatricality. It's another one of those albums that's got a whole lot of different voices, characters communicating with each other, and it's all incredibly evil sounding, particularly on this set of riffs right here, which remind me of another early second wave black metal band. Can you guess which one?
아니 원스 여러분들이
Yeah, I get major Samael vibes from that set of riffs, specifically in regards to that sort of weird dissonant harmony line they added to it. Albeit that Samael album came out in 1991, this came out in 1989. Albeit, there's probably demos of that Samael song from back in the 80s. Maybe Bellzlleb heard the demos and took influence from them. Maybe Samael were secretly Bellzlleb fans and never told anybody. Or maybe it's just convergent evolution.
Who knows?
But what I do know is that nobody was doing weird ambient sections like this back in the day in black metal, particularly coming out of that brutal of a riff set. And immediately going into an even more brutal set of riffs, upping the Candlemass influence even more with this like sort of doomy thrash metal, noisy solo. I don't even know what this is, but it's awesome. It's heavy as fuck, and it's absolutely unholy sounding. You know, I don't know exactly what it is. Somehow my listening to NSBM as a teenager caused me to massively overdose on right-wing social media and get totally burnt out on it in this gray space between my quarter-life crisis and my midlife crisis. But nowadays, a lot of times when I'm listening to metal, I'm like, could I possibly get that with some more Satan, please? And Bellzeb's all like, and you know what? God bless him for it. But here's the real kicker is that song I just played, that weird doom metal epic, that's not even close to being the weirdest song on this album. In fact, it's one of the more normal ones. Other songs see these guys incorporating a whole lot of ahead of their time type elements. For instance, the Bathory album that came out a year after this one, it's got plenty of parts on it. You might like go a little something like...
And we like that.
And you might be a fan of a band like Autopsy doing some weird psychedelic wah pedal shit in the middle of their extreme metal. Goes a little something like...
And we like that.
Well, imagine taking such disparate elements as those, incorporating them into Bellzlleb's weird melange of doom metal, thrash metal, and black metal, and having it actually work out really well. Because that's the kind of thing you can expect from a lot of songs on this album. You can also expect lots of nasty vocals, almost kind of like an impetigo thing going on with those weird sloshy noises he's making. And here's the weird whammy bar and wah pedal, psychedelic abuse over doomy riffs, kind of Autopsy. These aren't the Bathory style clean guitars I was talking about though, those are coming up. This is more of like a weird kind of voivod sounding section with the usage of tritones. But now here comes the Bathory style clean guitars. This consonant melody arising out of all of that nasty psychedelic chaos, coupled with these clean vocals are kind of Christian death sounding, very death rock. Just a whole lot of elements that you wouldn't think would go together, but they do. I mean, it sounds good to me. I also really like the weird kind of rolling sort of tribal drumming. It imbues everything with this dark sense of spirituality that fits the darkly satanic atmosphere they're going for. Vocal approach being changed up again towards a more conventional melodic structure, away from those wailing, wandering Christian death style goth rock vocals. But there's also a hint of like extreme metal gruffness to even the clean vocals on this album. Like, listen, I know it was cool having that chick in the band, but this new guy, it's fucking great. He's like the Johnny Paolini of obscure 80s black and doom metal. See how many people even get that fucking reference. But if you do miss having the lady on the vocals and them playing a slightly more traditional doom metal sound, I've got news for you. There's another band that kind of picked up that initial sort of stylistic intent from that first Bellzlleb album called Velwich. And this is going to sound kind of sacrilegious. But as much as I enjoy Bellzlleb's 1986 Satanic Metal EP, I think Velwich actually do that style a little bit better. It's a very similar sort of sound with these big, long, gothic, clean guitar-led build-up parts, and her vocals are very nice. But fret not, she's fully capable of conjuring the same sort of darkness that the first Velwich vocalist did on that first EP. The distorted guitar parts this time around are a little bit more trad heavy metal style.
Boom! Haunted house!
I told you she could maintain that same level of spookiness, but I really dig this shift towards more of like a dark power metal sound. During the groovier parts like this, it almost kind of sounds like Pagan Altar a bit. You know, it's kind of funny. As far as I know, nobody in Velwich was actually involved with Bellzaleb, but you know, it really does sound like they heard Bellzaleb's style on their initial music, saw them undergo the stylistic change towards black metal, and thought, yeah, that's cool and all, but we kind of wish you kept going with your old stuff. And they just decided, like, fuck it, we'll do it. It'd be like if there's some random Norwegian band that decided to sound like Dark Throne circa Soulside Journey right after A Blaze in the Northern Sky came out. Certainly a cool little stylistic digression. They only ever put out the one demo entitled Blood Noblewoman back in 1988. But getting back to the main event here, Bellzlleb. Second album comes out. Wouldn't you believe it? They got even fucking weirder. The odd sort of like autopsy-ish psychedelic parts had evolved to almost sound like the kind of stuff that Therion might be doing a couple years later. Things like off the Symphony Masses album. But even more shocking was the gradual weirding up of the cleaner guitar parts. Not really that Bathory-ish sounding anymore. Honestly, and you know, I can't find any English language interviews to prove this, but it sounds like they were listening to a whole lot of krautrock, stuff like Amandul 2 back in the 70s. Take those two weird new elements, you mix them with the kind of weird stuff Bellzlleb was already doing. You let go of some of the doom metal influence and bring in a whole lot more thrash, considerably up the complexity of the songwriting. You get Section 2, Arugusha no Shogai. Now honestly, it's probably my favorite album of theirs. They got this real talent for taking some pretty normal style thrash metal riffs and expanding on them in some pretty interesting directions, like this change up right here. Keep the same basic rhythmic skeleton, but at the end of each iteration of the riff, they add in this weird sort of sliding dissonant bar chord that enables them to transition very effectively into that sort of Therion style wandering melody. And also this is happening in a year or two before Therion even started writing riffs like this, so it's ahead of the time in that regard. Another trademark Bellzlleb compositional technique. You end a sequence of riffs on this ringing out note, put in a weird little drum fill, all of a sudden you're in wacky psychedelic land. Now that wouldn't be that unusual for weird proggy black metal in the early 2000s, but in the late 80s, that's still pretty ahead of its time. And I don't see any of those early 2000s psychedelic influenced black metal bands putting in sick thrash metal riffs like that. Essentially, this latter portion of Bellzlleb's discography is taking the aesthetics of black metal and then applying them to the songwriting coming out of the Germanic portions of Europe regarding the tech thrash boom. You know, your Coroners, your Death Rows, that sort of thing. And this development continued blossoming into their third and thrashiest album, the bizarrely titled Mr. Ri Kagutsto Sad. You know, the first time you read that, you're thinking they're saying the name Mr. Lee in English, then you realize, oh wait, Mr. Ri. You say that out loud, it's like,
I get it.
You know, it's a little Japanese English language pun type thing. I'll tell you what's mysterious about this album is the fucking album cover. It's like this weird composite shot of blue turquoise digital water, moldy bread, and like gears and chains running together. Fucking weird, man. It follows up on the style of Section 2 Arugusha no Shogai very effectively, though. The thrash metal component is even more notable this time around, particularly in the drum performance, which is very punky, lots of skank beats and D-beats, as well as in the vocal performance, which goes full-on East Coast thrash metal, complete with gang shouts. But the guitar playing under it is still all weird and layered and dissonant, basically the same kind of stuff we've come to know and love from Bellzlleb. What really sticks out for me about this album is how smooth strangely they integrate those weird psychedelic sections. For example, in this song, it seems like it'd be a pretty about face to jump out of that thrash metal into the weird psychedelic shit, but they managed to tie the whole song together by keeping that same sort of 1-2-3 beat structure from the thrash metal section going under this increasingly more bizarre psychedelic freakout, under all the weird wailing guitars and sliding bass lines, gradually increasing in chaotic complexity. You can still hear the ghost of that initial thrash metal riff. By the end of their career, these guys had pretty much turned into thrash metal's answer to the band Hawkwind, and personally, I think that's pretty cool. But as that sentence implies, yeah, this was the last Bellzlleb album. A few guys from this band went on to start a new band called Spooky Six Mouse that I haven't been able to find too much music from, but as far as I can tell, it's like a much more normal sort of prong-style groove metal sound, which doesn't really have much to do stylistically with the best of Bellzlleb, if you ask me. However, the bassist from the Mystery Kagutsto Sad album has recently, and by recently I mean as of like 2014, but recently reactivated his pre-Bellzlleb band Salamander. And I think this should be of interest to fans of the old school Bellzlleb sound, because despite being a little bit more towards the power metal end of the spectrum, at least back in the 80s, these guys were pretty stylistically congruent with the kind of stuff Bellzlleb was doing. They tend towards much darker sounding melodies than other sorts of neoclassical power metal bands of the time, and the vocal performance is also considerably more varied and dark, kind of shifting between more standard power metal vocals and this sort of darkly morbid gothic crooning. But more than anything, those guitar harmonies really possess some of that same sinister character that the more melodic kind of doom metal moments of Bellzlleb so excelled at. A lot of Salamander's songs are also structured very similarly to Bellzlleb, with their emphasis on very dramatic changes between movements. The lead guitar in this band is very interesting. There's a lot of dueling solos, where each solo being a very different style, abruptly switching between that sort of sinister bluesiness and more technically inclined neoclassical shredding that you would normally expect from such a power metal band. The vocals in this part are particularly Bellzlleb-esque, these weird layered, spooky ghost whispers in the background. It makes sense that when Bellzlleb needed a new bassist, they would hire somebody from this band, because even though they play power metal, it's a much darker stripe of power metal that has that same sort of avant-garde weirdness to it that Bellzlleb was always so good at. So while I haven't really heard tell of any planned Bellzlleb reunions, at least we got Salamander back on the scene, doing some dark, sinister Japanese music in the old style. Bellzlleb, fantastic band. I can almost guarantee you didn't know about them, because I didn't know about these guys until relatively recently, and this is like 100% the kind of shit that I enjoy listening to above almost everything else. But hey, maybe you did already know about Bellzlleb. Let a brother know. Either way, hopefully you enjoyed learning about them. Thanks for listening and or watching, and I'll see you next time.
Well, the truth is a boy King Bell said, guess what you all bet.